All right, welcome back. Hopefully you got a chance to stretch your legs. We just came back from Module 1, taking a look at WCF services. Bruno walked through some great demos of creating WCF services, hosting them a variety of different ways, consuming them a variety of different ways, and really, again, focusing on that, the endpoints and the address and bindings and contracts, which are some really core concepts to WCF that you're going to want to make sure that you grasp. In this next module, I'm going to come back in and say, well, now that we've looked at WCF services, how is it that we're going to be able to host those in other environments? Right? We talked in the previous module about being able to host them, in a .NET managed process. In the WPF app, we did it there, console applications, whatever. And so in this module, we'll say, okay, well, where is that managed process? And take a look at having the opportunity for that to not run in your own data centers, but maybe up in Azure. And so we'll look at a couple of different ways that you can go about doing that.
What if I want to run my service in, say, Singapore or Europe? Is that?
Definitely. And we'll talk about sort of the global nature of Azure, which is our cloud platform, and see that we've got data centers around the world. So we've got Asia, Europe, and of course, the US as well, and you've got a choice of data centers that you could host your code in there. So in this session, I'm going to start out with just a big picture sort of overview of Azure and talk about, where are the data centers and all that good stuff. And then we'll come back in and look at sort of 3 different environments that you might think about or ways that you might think about hosting a WCF service inside Azure. We'll first take a look at Azure websites, come back in and look at doing almost exactly the same thing, but inside what's called a web role, and then look at maybe a slightly more complex way to do it, but that gives you maybe a little more flexibility, looking at hosting WCF services in cloud service worker roles. Before I jump into that, though, I want to do a little bit of housekeeping. We had a little slide copy mishap in the previous module there. So again, the content that we're talking about here today is related to, but not completely covering the topics that are addressed in the 70-487 exam. So, I'm a big proponent of certification. Certification is really what got me the jobs that I was able to get, as a training manager, as a WAN manager. I started way back with good old NetWare and was a CNE and all that good stuff.
Novell.
Yeah, so certifications were really sort of how I justified, or at least proved my abilities through my career there. So I'm a strong proponent of it. And if you want to know more about the concepts that are tested on the exam, again, a great way to learn more about that is through the Microsoft official course and through a learning partner. Course 2487, Developing Windows, Azure, and Web Services, covers a lot of these topics in more depth. Right? Here we're going through it in one day, so we're not going to have time to get deep on pretty much any of these topics. So the other thing is, if you are looking at the Earn While You Learn, the code for that is now correct on the screen. So it's the AZ Web SVC that expires on 12/13/2013. So get in there quick and get your credit soon. AKA.MS MVA-voucher. All right. Actually, one other thing I will mention, and Bruno made a point of it as well, but he's been doing a really good job of sort of blogging as he's prepped. So if you jump up to Bruno's blog, there's a lot of great blog posts, and a lot of the code that he was using and will use will be available to you up there. I did mine a little more in one fell swoop. I've got a GitHub repository that has all my demo code and all that kind of stuff, and you can go to my blog, and in fact, I'll just jump over really quick to IE and pop that up. And at least as of today, the top post is related to the resources for today. And there's a link right there that you can use to download my demo code. I do still have a little bit of cleanup. And in fact, I'm not sure that I have my demo code for the last module checked in there yet. But you can always come back to this post and get the latest version of that. And there's also a link off to Bruno's blog there. And again, you can look back through his recent history. He's got a lot of WCF-related posts, and a lot of his sample code is available up there. So I noticed a number of questions in the chat window just about the availability of the demo code. So those are probably the best places to go get those. And again, keep coming back to those, because certainly I know I'll be updating mine as I get all of the final assets together after today. All right, so with that said, in this next section, I want to come back in and focus in on just Azure, the environment, right? Bruno made the point, Azure is our cloud platform. And the cloud is an important part of just how a developer ought to see the world of computing these days, and it's certainly an important part of how enterprises see the world of computing these days. So for me, really is I get back and just think about how does the cloud impact me? The cloud is really about running my code or storing my data on somebody else's stuff, right?
Not your headache anymore.
Right, yeah, or at least, offloading a portion of that headache, to somebody else and say, look, you take care of, keeping the servers powered and cooled and healthy and all that good stuff, and I just want to give you my code and make it run. And so that's really what I'm looking for out of a cloud platform, is to ease my pain.
And to scale it when your killer app really starts going epically popular.
Yeah, the example I always use for that is, who would have thought Toe Jam in a Jar would have sold so well, right? I didn't think it was going to, but then all of a sudden it takes off, And you're like, wow, I got to scale this site up. And, if I'm hosting these in my own data centers, I've got that problem of sort of matching my resources to the demand. And that can be pretty hard to do when you're having to do a purchase order and the machine doesn't ship for another week or something like that, right? So the cloud gives us sort of this flexibility to scale up, to scale down. The other thing that you get out of a cloud platform is the ability to consume services that you might not be able to host, right? Later on in Module 7, we'll be talking about Service Bus and being able to, relay services beyond corporate boundaries and that kind of stuff, authentication services and federated databases and a whole bunch of things that, man, I don't want to have to host those in my data centers. So let somebody else provide those services and let me just go consume them.
Yeah, some folks are even saying in 10 years, it'll be hard to find an IT department in a company.
Well, careful there. So with that said, if you're going to run your code and store your data on somebody else's servers, where are those other servers, right? So with Azure, we've got data centers around the globe. Bruno was talking about, what if I want to host data off in Singapore or something like that? So we've got 4 data centers off in the US. We've got 2 in Europe. And 2 in Asia, and I would expect that to grow over time as demand increases out there. Along with that, we also have a content distribution network that you can use. Imagine that you've got a website and you've got clients coming into that from around the world. I might want my web images or the media assets, et cetera, to be closer to the user that grabs them. And so we can use the content distribution network to put those assets out closer to where the end users who use them are. So definitely a healthy infrastructure, and you can feel comfortable running your code in our data centers there. So if you think about the cloud and you say, well, if it is about pushing some of that workload off to somebody else, if you think about what you have to do in-house to host your own code, that's kind of what's the right hand of the screen there is, right? Up at the very top on the right hand are the applications and the data. And I'm a SQL guy, and I like curly braces and semicolons and that kind of stuff, but it's been a long time since I was a Novell CNE. I'm not a big fan of installing server operating systems and doing, the actual hardware, wiring the racks up and all that kind of stuff, right? But if you look at hosting all this stuff in-house, you're responsible for that full stack. You can't just do the application and data. You have to have that whole foundation underneath that to build those applications on. And so really that's where Azure's going to come in. Over on the left-hand side, I've got this menu of services that are available in Azure, right? And they're not necessarily, I'll tell you, they're really in menu order when you jump into the Azure portal, so they're not really in order of the stack on the right-hand side. But one of the common things that you have to get into when you talk about cloud is this whole, what's your cloud model? Are you infrastructure as a service, or are you platform as a service, or are you software as a service, right? And so for me, really, when you think about infrastructure as a service, or really any of those models, it's about how much of that stack on the right are you asking your cloud vendor to take over for you, right? So in Azure, if you were to go out and do, what we would call infrastructure as a service, you'd be doing things like consuming our Azure virtual machines. If you think about that infrastructurally, what are some other things that you expect from your corporate infrastructure? I got to be able to keep my data somewhere. I need to be able to talk to the other machines on my network, right? So I need networking and all that kind of stuff. So for me, I think all of those kind of fit into that infrastructure as a service. What are your thoughts on IaaS, Bruno?
Well, that's a recent kind of addition to the platform, and it's turning out to be a quite popular one. I think the main kind of advantage of infrastructure as a service, if I want to migrate my apps to the cloud, my on-premises app, this allows me a very easy way to do that because it's like I'm on my local machine on my own local network. I have that kind of control. When we talk about platform as a service, it's going to be much more abstracted. You're not logging in, you're not running scripts, you're just saying publish from Visual Studio. So they're kind of different kind of models. I think for migration, infrastructure as a service, for greenfield new projects, I say go for platform. I think that's really the future.
Yeah, and so if you look at that platform as a service, and you talk greenfield or brownfield maybe, or there's also this learning curve. I've got developers who just know how to build on Windows servers, and we just want to let them host their VMs in the cloud. That's easy to do. It makes sense. People understand it. The concepts are great, and it's really just a virtual machine exactly like you would run on premise. It's just over there. It's not over here, right? But with platform as a service, you have to kind of rethink a little bit. I mean, the core code's the same. It's just the execution environment and how you get your code into that execution environment is a little bit different. But once you do that, you get this benefit of no longer caring about the virtual machine.
Upgrades are going to happen automatically.
Yeah, I don't have to perform hotfixes or service packs.
What if it crashes, though?
Yeah, then I can let the framework take over for me. And so with Platform as a Service, we have a service called Cloud Services. And inside the Azure data centers, there's this magical piece of software that's monitoring my cloud services and the virtual machines that are running in them.
Think of it as an operating system for the cloud.
Definitely, yeah.
For the data center.
It's keeping itself healthy, and it's just looking at all my cloud services, automatically restarting VMs, et cetera. If you take that, you still have a fair amount of configuration in cloud services. If you want less configuration and responsibility, we've got Azure Websites, which are sort of like Platform as a Service Plus. We've got hosted relational databases with Azure SQL Database. And then you can step all the way up into what people call software as a service, right? Software as a service is, man, I don't want to write any code at all. Just give me the darn thing and let me go use it, right?
Or I'm an ISV, I want to launch a business offering my software as a service.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, so either I'm providing the SaaS or I'm consuming the SaaS, right? And so certainly with Microsoft, we have Office 365 and hosted CRM and other solutions like that. But within an Azure perspective, we actually have third-party services. I can go out and through my Azure account, sign up with a partner like SendGrid for sending email. And I don't have to implement any of that. I just consume their service.
The nice thing, too, you only pay for what you use. Think of it as a la carte.
Yeah.
I don't pay for the whole, I only pay for those pieces that make sense for me.
Yeah, definitely. As I think that menu over on the left-hand side scares a lot of people. And you're like, oh my, I got to use all this stuff and everything costs money, right? Well, no, you use what you want. You only use it as much as you want it and only for as long as you need it.
And you can even shut it down and cut the cost of compute.
Yep. So good stuff. All right. So notice that we've got, again, a lot of ways that we can, restructure, rethink about how we run code or where we run code with Azure up there. So if you think about it specifically from a web services perspective, right, going back to thinking about WCF, or later on we'll talk about web API or that kind of stuff, where does Azure and web services sort of merge together? And so certainly we've got virtual machines. If you think about, hey, I just want to run a web service myself, I could be on Windows, or we support Linux distributions as well.
We do.
Yeah. So, somebody could just spin up a VM. It just happens to be running in our data centers. And they would do the same things to that VM in Azure that they would if it were a physical or a virtual machine running on premise.
Yeah, you have virtually unlimited control over it. If you need to modify registry settings, install specialized software, it's all there. And that, of course, now you have responsibility as opposed to the platform as a service. In other words, cloud services. It's kind of a fire and forget for the most part.
Yeah, definitely. So that's where cloud services come in with this idea of web and worker roles. They're still just virtual machines. They're Windows virtual machines. I don't have a Linux choice with that. But they're Windows virtual machines that are pre-configured, pre-updated, pre-managed. I just send a nice little zip package effectively with my code and some structural information, and I say, hey, Azure, make it run. And it spins the VMs up for me. It deploys my code. It watches them, makes sure they're healthy. So that's a great way to run.
And if I want to, like, say, do 2 of these or 3 of these, literally, I just change a number either through a little web script, a little PowerShell script, or there's an API that I can call into to say, hey, can you scale this up to 10 instances?
Yeah.
Or go to the portal and just say, hey, bring it back down to 2. It's kind of quiet time of year.
Yep, indeed. Yeah, scale up, scale down, auto scale, good stuff. Cloud services, though, let me step back. Cloud services are still virtual machines. You can, in fact, even remote desktop into them and stuff, or you can install things through startup scripts and all that. So you've got a lot of configuration options If you don't want that, websites are the way to go. You say, I don't need that amount of configuration. I don't even want to worry about the VM, right? I don't want to be thinking about startup scripts. I don't want to have that responsibility of thinking about it. Give me a simpler platform, right? But still give me the ability to host scalable code, right? And that's really where I think websites come in, is the scalability without the concern of the platform underneath.
What if I want to like map my own domain into it though? Like I want to have like brunoturkley.com and I don't want to have cloudapp.net. Is that possible?
Definitely. And with all of these, we can be putting our own custom domains in front of them. The websites are going to require that I be somewhere above the free usage tier to be able to do that. The other important thing to think about that is that Azure as a service isn't going to provide DNS for you, right? So you're going to have your DNS hosted somewhere else, or maybe running inside an Azure VM.
GoDaddy, whatever it is.
Yeah. So whoever your DNS hosting provider is, but then you can set up CNAME records or things like that point in to the Azure resources.
Did you say something about free? Can I start for free without any risk?
Yeah, definitely. Websites, every subscription, even if your trial is over, and of course I'll get to the site here in a minute, but there's a free trial, 30 days, $200, whichever one comes first. But even if your trial is over, every subscription gets 10 free websites and 10 free mobile services, which we're not really talking about mobile services today, but man, they're cool too, so you ought to check those out.
We need to come back for that.
Yeah, definitely. So storage services, so if you've got a web service running in one of those 3 execution environments, virtual machines, cloud services, websites, the web services probably want to work with data. So that data's got to be somewhere. And so we're going to come back in the next module and talk about storage services. But we've got tables, which are sort of a NoSQL, key value type store. We've got blob storage, which I always think of as like the file system in the cloud.
Right.
And then we've got queues, which are a really easy way to build loosely coupled systems.
Right.
Yeah, definitely. I know you had done some work with, what was it, CQRS?
Yeah, the command query responsibility segregation architecture. Yes.
I just wanted to see if you could say it. So.
I could barely say that.
But definitely relying heavily on queues. And for me, storage queues, I think, are one of the coolest services up there.
They're triply replicated, too.
Yeah. All these storage services are replicated in triplicate. So I don't want to steal your thunder for your module coming up. So if you want something more relational, if you're coming from a .NET background, a SQL background, you like SQL Server, you rely on relational structures and stored procedures and triggers and functions and indexes and all that good stuff, we have a hosted, effectively, quote unquote, that's my term, not Microsoft's, SQL database, where you can just go in and literally within minutes have a database that's yours without having to go and install SQL Server and provision the bare metal for it and all that kind of stuff. Of course, if you want full control over that SQL instance, go back to the other left-hand side with virtual machines and just install SQL Server in a VM.
Choose it from the gallery and you're 10 minutes, you've got it running.
You're good to go, right?
It's very economical, by the way. I've known people that have saved 90% on their database costs with SQL Database.
Oh, really? Oh, okay. Yeah, that's
formerly known as SQL Azure, by the way, if you've heard that term.
Yeah, it's had a number of Azure or SQL Data Services.
Yes.
And the SQL Azure, now Azure SQL Database. So, yeah. It's all the same goodness, though. Arose by any other name. All right. So, and then certainly one of the most sort of services-oriented services is the service bus service. So I've seen how many times I could say service there. But Service Bus gives you a more robust queuing mechanism than Azure Storage Queues does.
Right.
We get relays, messaging, topics, a whole bunch of other cool stuff. And you're going to talk about Service Bus.
I just wrote an article in MSDN. It's going to come out soon around the Arduino and this notion of connected devices in this world. They're predicting like 50 billion devices by 2020.
Yep.
And so how are those devices going to communicate? Well, the Service Bus is one great way.
50 billion devices relative to 10 billion people.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we're all going to have a lot of devices connected, and definitely we're going to need back-end services like this to communicate. Good stuff. All right, so that's the overview. That sort of sets the landscape. What is Windows Azure? Let's come back in and look a little more concretely at how is it that we can take a web service and host it in some of these different environments, websites, web roles inside cloud services, and worker roles. Right. So starting out here, I'm going to talk about hosting a WCF service in a Windows Azure website. So Windows Azure websites, I said, are probably the simplest, other than mobile services, probably the simplest code execution option that we have in Azure, right? You can just go spin up a website in minutes or seconds.
Yeah, you just right mouse click from Visual Studio for crying out loud.
And that's another good point. You mentioned it too, but I should point this out. I'm not going to be demoing it this way today, but everything that we do, you could script. there's whole management APIs that you could integrate these, the provisioning of services or the shutting down of services or the configuration of services, into your own build processes, or you could call into the management APIs from your own applications. If you look at the Azure Management Portal, it's just consuming the same APIs that you have access to, right? You could sort of build your own management portal.
I used to be a field engineer, and we used to go to customer sites and find slow-performing machines like CPU utilization too high, memory running out, disk I/O slow. And so we'd set up these performance counters, and you can do that in Azure, and then you can scale up or scale down based on performance characteristics, kind of automatically.
Yeah, and so the APIs on Azure are fantastic, and you can definitely get a ton of discoverability into what you're running up in Azure. But Azure websites are really simple. I can go and provision one in the portal, or however it is that I want to, literally within seconds have a website that's addressable to me. I can write code the way that I like, right? If I'm a .NET dev and I want to write ASP.NET sites or WCF services or web APIs or MVC,
WordPress.
Yeah, or whatever, I've got those, but then I can go the other way. I could say, hey, I want to write PHP, or I want to write Python, or hey, Node's a hot topic these days, right? So you can run Node.js. We've got the Express.js framework that you can use for that. So you can really sort of pick and choose. It's pretty much, if the framework will run on Windows, you can do it, for the most part.
There's that gallery, and so literally you can just choose from all these different platforms, and just one or two clicks, puff, WordPress site.
Yeah, and then you can go live really easily. We got a ton of deployment options. I got a slide on that coming up. And then scalability. Once it's up, like I say, that toe jam in a jar really starts selling. I can go drag a slider over to the right and scale my website up based on that demand. So that's really cool. So I mentioned the publishing methods. This website's hosted up in Azure. Effectively, think of it as IIS just running out there for you, and so you can FTP into these things. But it also supports pulling the source code for you from TFS, Web Deploy, Get, Dropbox. It's pretty cool. I remember one of the something else about Azure is it changes rapidly, which is really cool. I mean, tons of new functionality constantly coming out. And I was doing a demo about deployment, and all of a sudden, boom, there's all these other options up there. And I'm like, wow, that's cool.
Yeah, you can even set up continuous integration and deployment.
With TFS and Git both let you do that. Really cool stuff. All right, so let's actually jump over here, and I'll finally get to some coding. So I've got actually my development environment, and this is something else I've been doing a lot lately, is an Azure virtual machine. So I just went and spun up. I can even show you sort of how the process for that is. So this is the Windows Azure website. And if you don't have an Azure account, you can jump up here and notice there's a free trial. So you can sign up free 30 days or $200, whichever comes first. But even if the trial expires, remember, you still get up to 10 free websites, up to 10 free mobile services, and for the first year, a free 20 megabyte SQL database there as well. And then once you really start consuming those and you find it worthwhile, then you can scale up and start to pay for them.
Don't worry about that credit card. We just need that to validate your identity.
Yeah, it will ask you for a credit card as you go through the free trial, but you will not be billed anything. In fact, at the end of the 30 days, unless you tell us otherwise, your services are going to get shut down.
Is that right? I didn't know that part.
Yep. So they'll go away eventually. You'll get some notices, but eventually they'll decide, yep, okay, you've moved on.
Risk-free.
And shut your services down. So anyhow, but I already have an account. So up here in the top right-hand corner, I've got a link to the portal. So I'll go ahead and click into the portal and sign in with my Live ID. So your subscription is tied to your Live ID. And you can have multiple subscriptions. You might have one for your personal business that you have on the side. You might have one through your MSDN account at work. You might have one because you're the QA lead, and you have one for your business to deploy QA into. So each subscription is associated with a Live ID, and one Live ID can have access to multiple subscriptions. So it's sort of a many-to-many there.
And I might mention, Brett, if you have an MSDN premium account, you get some Azure hours. And if you're an entrepreneur, you can get a lot of this for free by joining BizSpark.
Yeah, definitely.
BIZ Spark. Check it out.
Yeah, BIZSPARK.com. Sign up, and tons of great resources, including Azure monthly benefits. So really cool stuff. But under virtual machines, I just came in and made a new virtual machine from the gallery. And there's a ton of pre-built images here. I just went in and picked a Windows Server 2012, R2 data center. And went and installed SQL Server in it and Visual Studio, and boom, that's my dev machine. And that's great because I can get to it anywhere. I have a Surface RT that I like to bring to restaurants with me because it's got a long battery life, and I can just remote into this thing and code on my RT. So it's really cool.
I'm going to tell your wife you said that.
When I'm traveling. So all right. So anyhow, so I just went in and spun one of those up, and that's sort of the environment that I'm actually running in is, in fact, and notice I'm RDP'd into a VM that I have running up inside Azure there. So, but thinking about websites, right? If I jump over to the websites on the left-hand side, I see that I've got a couple of websites already in place, but I could make a new website really easily if I just came in here and clicked on New, under Compute and Website. I've got a quick create, which is going to let me just basically specify the host name and the data center that I want it to run in. Remember those data centers that we have around the globe. Custom create gives you a little more control over the website that gets created for you, and even allows you to tie in a database as a resource to that website. Or the third choice was from the gallery, and you were mentioning the gallery there. And you'll notice that we've got pre-configured websites that'll let you do, Drupal, WordPress, blogengine.net. There's tons of these gallery projects up here, and you can, within a few seconds, have a WordPress blog up and running or something like that.
This is a very popular option in the platform.
Yeah, definitely. So I'm actually going to go back here, and I'm going to do a, oops, sorry.
So you mean to tell me right now you're using a virtual machine up in a data center?
Yes. So I'm sitting in the studios at Microsoft. I'm remoted into an Azure VM that's actually running in a data center somewhere in the Western U.S. And then from there, I'm connecting back to the portal to create other resources up in Azure. But once I'm into my dev machine, I just think of it as a machine.
I can't even tell.
Yeah, it might as well be on my own network, right? So anyhow, I'm going to go into Quick Create. And I'm going to create a site here. I'm going to call it my Lat Lawn Demo. And you'll notice that this is really the host name that's going to be on top of a domain name .azurewebsites.net. And that's where, Bruno, you were asking, can I put a custom domain on front of this? Yeah, you could. You can go in. If you step off of the free usage tier on websites, you can go in and create CNAMEs that point off to this and have nice, pretty domain names sitting on top of that. So anyhow, so Latlon demo is going to be this, and I'm out in Redmond in Seattle, so area, or Redmond, Washington, so West U.S. I'm going to let it put it in a data center out there, and I'll just say create website. And you'll notice that up here on the portal, it's just churning away, creating this website for me, and it'll take a little bit of time, but it's already running.
What?
So when I said seconds, that's what I mean. I've already got a website running, and it's really there. I can follow this link to it, and Azure sticks a little placeholder site for me in there, but this website's been successfully created. It's just ready for me to go stick something into it. Pretty cool, right? So I've got a pre-existing solution here, and again, I mentioned at the beginning on my blog, there's a link to the GitHub zip that has all this stuff on here. But I'm going to jump into Module 2, and I've got some handy little snippets. I don't have this magical copy-paste tool that Bruno's got, so mine is just copy-paste. But you have access to these snippets, and it's sort of my own instructions, but they kind of turn into little labs if you're willing to deal with my typos. But along with the snippets, I've got a pre-existing solution, so let me go pull that up as well. And I'm going to create this service that's going to help me do some calculations on latitudes and longitudes, right? So I've got this Latlon service, and this really sort of follows the model that Bruno demoed previously. So I won't spend a lot of time on this, but you'll notice that I have one assembly that has my contracts in it. And the contracts, those were the interfaces, and if I had data contracts, which I don't, mine are just doubles that I'm shipping back and forth, so I didn't deal with any data contracts. But I've got this iLatlon utilities service inside my contracts assembly over here. And basically, this is just an interface that says, hey, look, we're going to allow you to calculate the distance between two Latlon coordinates, right? So you'll pass in one pair of latitude and longitude, and then a second pair of latitude and longitude, and then it's going to help you figure out, or the service is supposed to help you figure out the actual distance between those 2 points on the face of the Earth, which isn't flat, right? So it's got to figure out the curvature and all that good stuff. And so I can return that to you in radians, because that's how you always tell people, how far is it? Oh, well, it's about, 30 radians, right?
That's what I do.
Oh, yeah. So instead of making you deal with just radians, I let you pull it back as nautical miles. So if you were a boater, I might want to know how many nautical miles do I have to go from point A to point B.
You did this for your dad, didn't you? Your dad was a sailor.
Yeah, so my folks have a boat, and they had this dream of just sort of being able to cruise, down to the Bahamas, et cetera. So they had this great service that sent me their position periodically, and sometimes it would wig out. And I'd have to know, like it would say, today we're in the Bahamas, tomorrow we're in Brazil, and it's a sailboat. I don't know how they got there. So I used the distance between the points and some general estimation of how fast a sailboat could go to decide if that point was valid or not, right? And so I would scrub those out if the distance was too far. But I also have another method that will return kilometers and another one that returns miles. So really the work is all done in radians, and then we'll convert from radians to these other units here. So that's my interface. I've got another assembly here called services, and if I open that one up, this is where I actually go implement that contract. Right? So this is the implementation of that, and here's my radians between 2 points. I'm not going to talk about the math here, mainly because I couldn't explain it. I stole it, and so there's the links to the resources that I used as I went in and built this method. But basically, when I'm all done down here, this little guy right here is going to be the distance in radians between the two latitudes and longitudes that you pass in as arguments. Cool? And we'll return those back, and that's going to go back to the caller as just a double. So I take in a series of doubles, and I return a double back. And then I have a number of other method signatures that have the exact same arguments and return values, but return them in different units. Nautical miles takes the radians and just multiplies them by 60 because there's 60 nautical miles per degree. We have kilometers between points that does the 60,000 or 6,371 kilometers around the face of the Earth there, I guess. Is that right?
Architecturally, Brett, could you have actually put different kind of metrics on different endpoints theoretically? Like,
oh, sure, yeah. I could have had the miles service and the kilometer service,
I got
right?
you.
Yeah, and I would have done that by breaking them up into different interfaces. And so here I've got all the functionality in one interface. I could have, as you talked about, had a different interface sort of for each metric that you wanted or each unit.
The Europeans would have used kilometers. The
Right.
Americans might want miles.
Yeah, definitely, right. I could add the boater's endpoint that gave nautical miles, the U.S. endpoint that returned them in statute miles, European one for kilometers, whatever out there. Definitely. So that's really sort of how you structure your interfaces and your endpoints out there. So that's really the implementation of it. With those two things right there, I have a WCF service, right? It's just where am I going to host it? That's kind of that question, right? And so in the previous module, you had it running in, I think, a console host and then also in a WPF host. So I've got a console host over here. So if I look at this program, it's basically, and I've commented this to heck, so if you grab the source code, you'll have all my comments. But basically, this is going to spin up a service host. And this guy comes out of that system.service model namespace. When we were saying that system.service model, that's WCF's home, right? So it goes in and uses the service host. And that's really what any of those hosting environments is going to use if they are going to host a service, is one of these service hosts. And we tell the service host, hey, you're going to spin up a class that's one of those lat-long utility services. And that's going to be the class that provides the functionality of your service. And we can provide a base address for all the endpoints. You don't have to do this, that's optional. You can specify the fully qualified address for each endpoint as you add it. But if you add the base endpoint or the base address once, it keeps you from having to specify it over and over and over again, and then you can change it in one place. So this localhost 8000 lat-long is going to be the base address that all my service endpoints are going to listen on, right? So then I come in and we add a service endpoint. Remember, we talked about endpoints having an address. So this takes that base address and adds on lat-long utilities. So that's the address. The binding is going to be a basic HTTP binding. So this will work over HTTP. It'll be SOAP-based messages. In fact, there was a question in the Q&A about the web HTTP binding versus basic or WS HTTP. So basic and WS HTTP binding do SOAP messages over HTTP, versus the web HTTP binding does what's called plain old XML or POX messages. It doesn't have all the heaviness of SOAP, but it's still XML as a format, message format back and forth there. But anyhow, so this is going to be SOAP over HTTP.
Now, Brett, you could have put this in a configuration file, but you're doing it programmatically in this case.
I'm doing it programmatically because I know if I typed it in XML, I was going to type it wrong. So,
good enough for me.
So, and then this is the interface. This is the contract that clients are going to have access to. If they come in at this address over basic HTTP, it's that interface. The radians, nautical, kilometers, and statute miles that they'll have access to. So there's my endpoint. And then I wanted to allow clients to be able to get metadata. So I add in the service metadata behavior there and open up an endpoint for metadata exchange in there as well, right? So that's what that code is doing. And then I just tell the host to open. Turn it on, and boom, at that point, I've got a service host. It's now listening. And the rest of it is just some code that I did, really more for debugging, but it's kind of cool to see. This just loops through the host, goes and finds all the channels that it's listening on, and basically tells us the URIs that it's listening on. So I can see that in my console host. So that's really just a little report.
It's kind of like a service metadata out on the console.
Yeah, a way for me to not have to go looking for the URL, right? And then I tell it to wait for the user to press enter. So this sort of blocks the thread and keeps that host open, right? Once they press enter, then we move on and we close the host and shut down, right? So that console host is going to basically freeze there. So the final piece is I've got a client. So my client application is a Windows 8.1 client. It's a store app. And basically in the main page.xaml, I've got, it's going to let you type in a starting latitude and longitude and an ending latitude and longitude. So those are some text boxes. And then when you click on the get distance button, we'll call into the service and go get the distances. But for some reason, I have to overdo all my demos, so I stuck a map on there that shows you the 2 points and lets you pick the starting and end points on the maps. So all the rest of this is more just keeping you from having to type latitudes and longitudes into the text boxes. So the interesting part here then is that I have a service reference. So in the previous module, Bruno showed adding a service reference. And so I already have one in place. I called it latlon WCF here. And if I went in and configured it, it already is expecting to find a service on that address. But if I moved my endpoint somewhere else, I'd have to come update that URL so that the client app knew where its service was. All right, so let me go ahead and spin up my console host here. So notice that right now in my solution, contracts is the startup project. I can tell that because it's bold. I'm going to go to my solution and right-click on it and go to properties and tell it instead to start up whatever project I'm currently in. All right, so I'm going to turn that on. And then I can come down here to my console host, and then from the debug menu, tell it to just start without debugging.
Just by way of review, we decided we could host a service in IIS. We could host it inside Windows Service or in a managed app, and you chose a console managed app.
Yep, this is a managed app. And so here's something I always forget to do in my demos. Notice that my demo crashed, but that's okay. That way you know what to do when this happens to you. And basically you'll notice up here, it's telling me that access is denied. I don't have permissions to open up an endpoint on this machine. And the reason why that's happening is because, no, sorry, I didn't mean debug. Let me close this. Visual Studio has to be running as administrator. So let me just close out a studio here. And I had opened it up directly from the solution file, but I have a shortcut here that just automatically runs as admin. So let me respin that up as administrator here.
I say always run as administrator in Visual Studio. Never run
as... and that's why I leave the shortcut down here, but if I shift, well, I can't do it now because it's already there. I'll take this other one. Shift and right-click on it and go to advanced. I just turn on that run as administrator, so it always starts that way. And I have a VS command prompt that I do the same thing with. So it says, hey, at least here I know I'm always running as admin when I'm out of that command prompt. So anyhow, let me pull that project right back up, back down to console host. Ooh, did I not save? Let me go to properties. Current selection. I guess I didn't save my changes before I exited out there. So, okay. Down to console host, and again, debug, start without debugging, and there it is. So there's my service up and running, and now I can make sure that I've got the right endpoint. Let me mark this. Oops, sorry. Got an extra space. There you go. And enter to copy. And now I can come back up to my 8.1 client. And because I'm not in a debug session, that was the point of running without debugging the console host, I can now modify this project. So I'll go to the service, configure its reference, and just paste that in to make sure it's correct, and hit OK. And it'll go update and make sure that it knows all the current metadata about that service and everything.
So basically, the client's going to connect to the service to consume data. You're just telling it where that service lives.
Yep. I just updated the service reference. And so now I can debug that on the local machine, and my Windows 8 project should build and deploy here. Like a bolt of lightning, it rockets to the screen. Cool. But here's my starting latitude and longitude, and then here's my ending latitude and longitude. And that's just up here in the Seattle area. So the red dot's over here on campus, the Microsoft campus, and the green dot is the Space Needle. Right, so you can zoom in on those and see them. And I could right-click on my map and set a new, starting or ending position or whatever, and
cool.
Zoom out. Right, so all that's doing is editing these latlons for me up there. And then if I want to find out how far it is between those 2 points, I can go get my distances, and there they are. So these results came back from that service. Right, and I have it showing me the service that it hit, and then also showing me the results that came back for all those different methods out there. Pretty cool stuff.
It is. But depending on when you go, it will change how long it will take to get there. It could be a pretty long commute to Seattle.
I get your point. Yes, yes, that's true. All right, so let me close this service down. Hey, in 8.1, if you drag an app down to the bottom, in 8, it would terminate it for you. In 8.1, you have to hold it there until the tile flips, and then it shuts down. So you'll notice when I come back to Studio now, it'll eventually let that app terminate, and I'll kick out of the debugger. If you don't hold it there, I promise there it goes. It'll kick out of the debugger. If you don't hold it there, it doesn't terminate, and you have to hit stop in the debugger to stop the app. So
I like that feature because it just suspends it. It means you can come back to it nice and quick.
Yep. So, all right. So anyhow, so there's my sort of running in a console host. So we're talking about web services, though, or websites, right? So let me come in here and add in a website. And this is just a good old ASP.NET website. I'm going to pick a ASP.NET empty website.
So the idea here is I want to have a web interface to my web service. Is that kind of where you're going with this?
Sorry, let me flip this up to 4.5. Why am I not seeing my normal? Oh, I did website. I'm a dork. Sorry. Say that again, Bruno.
The reason you're doing a website here is you want to abstract away the web service, or you want to provide a different interface?
Well, because I'm going to deploy it up into an Azure website.
I see.
So I want an ASP.NET website that I can deploy up into my Azure website. So I did add website. I didn't mean that. I mean add new project. There we go. I'm happier now. Come down to web, and then I'm just going to add an ASP.NET web application, and I'm going to call this my latlon.hosts.webhost.
So this would be like the other option. We're going to host an IIS now.
Right. We're going to host this in IIS running up in Azure, right? So instead of a console host, this is going to be my web host down here. And I'll go ahead and say OK. And I had it build an empty site for me. Well, I'm going to have it build an empty site for me. I'm not going to mess with any of these other things here right now. And so I don't need to turn on any other frameworks. I'm going to go ahead and just say OK. And I'll get this empty website. And then from there, I'm going to right-click on that and add in a new item. And that's going to be from, actually, let's just type in WCF. There we go. I'm going to host just a WCF service, right? And you'll notice that it wants to call the thing something.svc. I'm going to call this latlon utilities.svc. And it goes ahead and creates a set of project files as well as references. Notice that I've got now system.service model referenced and a few other things in there as well. But let me collapse that. It added in this interface for me, which I don't need. I already have one up in contracts. It also added in an implementation for me down here, which I don't need. I already have it up in services. So I'm going to come up here to my references and add in a reference to those solution projects for the contracts and the services. And then I'm just going to delete the files that it gave me down here because I don't need them. See you, wouldn't want to be you. Cool?
Makes sense.
So now if I go into the pure SVC file, you see that it's really nothing but an ASP.NET tag up here at the top saying this thing is a service host, as opposed to a page, as opposed to anything else, right? And because I don't have the code here, I don't have to do any of this stuff. I can get rid of all the code behind and language specifications. And now I just need to tell it where its service is. So this was going to be from latlon.services. And make sure I get the name right, Latlon Utilities Service.
So this is a web service within an ASP.NET application.
Yes, this is a WCF service running inside. So in this case, we're going to let ASP.NET be the host. Instead of the console application being the host, we're going to let ASP.NET be the host, running on IIS.
And when I host the ASP.NET, that in effect deploys both the service as well as the website.
Yes. Yeah. Well, the service, think of it just like an ASP.NET page. It's programmatic features inside the site. So when I deploy it, those programmatic features are going to go with it. But that's really cool. My website has no code. I'm just leveraging the pre-existing service that I've already written up inside these libraries up here, right? So I'm telling it, hey, go host that service for me. Here's a web host. Cool.
So no user interface. It's simply going to be, you're going to have a user interface in this one?
Well, the Windows 8.1 client is going to go grab it.
Okay.
Right? This is purely a host running in a site here. So let me go make sure I've got my I's and T's dotted here. Latlon Utilities. That's core.services. That's what was. Yeah, I did. my name didn't feel right here. Core.services. There we go. That feels better. Cool. All right. So there we go. And now I can actually right click on this guy. Sorry, down here. And let's go run them in the browser. And ASP.NET is nice enough to give me this nice little sort of service, documentation page here. And when we talk about metadata, sort of the core way that web services share metadata, SOAP services do is through what's called WSDL, or Web Service Description Language, or the Metadata Exchange Protocol, MEX. Right? And so here's the WSDL for it, and there's my nautical miles between 2 points and kilometers between 2 points operations and all that good stuff. Right?
So a client could go to that just to see how to talk to the service.
Yep. So in fact, that URL is the URL of my service. So I can now come back over to my client, my 8.1 client, go update that service reference. Not update, sorry, configure. So I want to change its URL and paste in the one that's going to my local website that's running that service for me and say, okay, and it's going to go reconsume that information for me. I'm just going to run the 8.1 client unchanged. I won't bother resetting my points this time. Get distances. And notice that this time it is, in fact, coming from localhost 7.137. It's coming from that website, and I still get my distances and all that stuff coming back for me. Really cool.
So theoretically, if this was a real Windows Store app, now all the people that bought that app can access your service.
Well, except that the service is running on my machine
right now,
right? So let's fix that, right? So now I can come back over here, and I've got this web host. We see that it works locally. We see that the service functions. I just need to get it off of my machine and push it up into Azure. And remember, when I started all this, I came over and built this site up in Azure, right? So I want to deploy it into there. So I'm going to right-click on my web host down here and just say Publish. And at that point, Visual Studio is going to help me go publish this up into Azure. Now, it doesn't have any existing profiles because I don't have any yet. So I'm going to go ahead and import some by first signing in to my Azure subscription. And
so this is enabling you to do a direct publish to a data center without really doing much of anything else. No remoting in, no virtual machines, just publish.
So I just signed into Azure with my Live ID, and from this drop-down, it'll say, hey, here's all the sites. I already have one in the oven that's pre-baked. That's the lat one, but this is the one you saw me build earlier. So that's the site I want to publish into.
I do see the new button, so I could theoretically even do a new one on the fly.
You could build a new website right here on the fly. And remember, I talked about all the APIs. That's all it's doing is calling to the Azure environment and creating a new site on the fly. Really cool. So I'll hit OK there, and it's going to go figure out how does it publish to that site. And I'm going to leave all these at the defaults, but that's the destination URL that it's going to go up to. And I can next on through this. If you have to change, compile or database connection strings, this is your chance to do it. This is, at this point, sort of a normal web deploy thing. And I'll just hit publish, and I get this cool little, the output window, but web publish activity. Sorry, it's going too fast for me. Web publish activity tells me it's already happened, it's done. And in fact, it already pulled up the site for me. And remember, the service name was latlonutilities.svc. Right, so latlonutilities.svc. Make sure that's right. Cool.
There it live.
Is. Now that's real. So if any of you out there on streaming land were to actually enter that URL in, you would see this service coming back here for you. So now I can simply go back and take my client and let me go update that. Sorry, my 8.1 client. Go to my service reference and configure it. Paste that in and OK. And now my 8.1 client is going to really go into an Azure website and hit a service that's actually running in Azure.
I like this idea better than your ToeJam idea.
Yeah, hey, but I tell you, don't knock the ToeJam. Somebody's going to want it. So anyhow, pretty cool.
Nice stuff. Good job.
All right, so that's going into a website. Notice how easy, it's almost like you forget I made a website. The creating of the website part of that in Azure, was like 10 seconds a demo or something. It was done, right? So that was so trivial to just make that happen. That's really cool, right? So I'm going to start running really late here, so I got to pick up the pace here a little bit. But let's look at doing it in cloud services, right? So that was websites. I said that's kind of platform as a service plus, right? I didn't even think about VMs or anything, right? Just boom, go make one for me. Cloud services are still easy, but give you more configuration options. And with more configuration options, you have more responsibility to make good choices, et cetera, out there.
But still less configuration than infrastructure as a service, the virtual machine choice.
Definitely, a lot less than VMs. And in fact, because of that, I'm not going to demo VMs, because setting up a web service in a VM is the same thing as setting it up on a Windows server. It's the same process, other than opening up an endpoint. And I'll talk about that briefly into the cloud service. But anyhow, so looking at Azure Cloud Services, a cloud service is a collection of related virtual machines. Those virtual machines could be what are called web roles, which are really just Windows servers with IIS. They could be worker roles, which are Windows servers without IIS.
That's the only difference?
Yeah, well, basically, yeah. Or they could be a virtual machine. So your virtual machines actually also persist or exist in a cloud service, and I'll explain that coming up here.
How do I know if I need a web role or worker role?
Well, so think of your own data centers. Think of the workloads that you host on IIS. If you want to do that in a cloud service, you want a web role. Think of the workloads that you host not on IIS. It's a Windows server, but it's not IIS. Those are the type of Windows services, background processing tasks,
encoding
whatever.
videos, stuff like that.
Or heck, what about this? We don't have Linux web and worker role VMs. But what if you wanted to have an Apache web server? You didn't want IIS. Well, why do I need IIS at all? I want Apache. So I'll take a worker role, script the install of Apache at role startup time, and now we've got an Apache server running in a cloud service, right? So pretty cool. All right. So these are the platform as a service model, though, right? These give us a way to work with code and not have to worry as much about the VMs that are running underneath them. And the way that the Azure Fabric Controller does that for us is by making these things stateless. It can update them, it can swap them out, it can move them, it can delete them, it can do whatever it wants because it's not worried about maintaining anything that's on them. The only thing that's mine that's on those things is my code. So it can throw one of my VMs away, spin up a new one, redeploy my code, and everything's fine.
And typically you're talking to storage, which is abstracted away. So even if you have a new machine.
As long as I'm talking to storage, right? So that's where platform as a service gets a lot of people is they think, oh, well, I stuck that on the C drive. Well, the C drive may not be the same thing when you come back the next time, right? So that's the key thing to remember with these. And if you invest in stateless, you'll love platform as a service.
I think this is the future long term.
So in fact, with that in mind, right? So here, imagine I've got my data center running up there in Azure, and I go deploy a web role. And so the Fabric Controller is responsible for taking my code, going and spinning up a VM somewhere. Adjacent to those is also the storage abstractions. We'll come back and mention that. But it's going to take my code and go spin up a VM and deploy my code to it. If that VM crashes, though, it's not like somebody's going to run over to the rack and stick a floppy in the drive and try to copy all my files out before they reboot or destroy the VM. No, they're just going to throw the thing away, go spin up a fresh copy of it, and redeploy my code to it. Which means if there's anything that I stuck on the hard drive of that VM, it's gone, right? So in other words, I don't want to keep anything on the VM. I want to push it off into storage. So if that VM were instead putting its data in storage, tables, blobs, queues, or Azure SQL Database, then when that VM goes down and crashes, that's okay because my data is still over here in storage. I've still got my data. So it can just spin up another VM and the VM just goes and points right back to the data. The other cool thing about that is scale. If one VM can do it, any number of VMs can do it. So now I can just spread these guys out and let them all access the same data, and that's where I get my scale up, scale down with this platform as a service.
That Fabric Controller is pretty smart. I'm noticing it's putting a VM on separate server racks.
Yeah.
In case the whole rack goes down or the switch goes down.
Yep. Try and keep my service resilient there. All right, so if you think about a little more structurally what's happening inside the Azure Data Center, when you go create a cloud service, remember my website had a name? Cloud services also are going to have a name, but they may point to multiple machines instead of just one website. A cloud service comes with a firewall that's going to protect the assets that are in it, as well as a load balancer. And so I can go create just a persistent virtual machine. This is one of those IaaS VMs. And I can run SQL Server, let's say, or whatever the heck you want. It could be a Linux box, could be a Windows box, whatever.
Python on Linux if you want.
If you want to let traffic get into that virtual machine, though, you've got to, in the firewall in Azure, create an endpoint, right? And that endpoint could say, hey, take this public port and set any traffic in it back to this VM, this single VM back there. Of course, the VM itself is going to have its own firewall. Right? Windows has its own built-in firewall that you're also going to have to go open up rules on or whatever. But so you can certainly do that, fully functional. But with web roles, we tend to work instead with load-balanced endpoints. Right? So let's say port 80 coming into a website. And the cool thing about that is that when I go spin up another copy of the exact same code on another VM, the load balancer can now just round robin between those two web roles for me. Right? And my client doesn't necessarily have to know which one they're hitting. Of course, that means I have to be thinking about session state and other things like that, but okay. Same thing with worker roles. Worker roles can actually have publicly exposed endpoints. They don't have to be just for background processing. And so you can expose ports through them and even load balance those back there as well if you want to. And while these VMs are running in Azure, they have access to all the other goodness of Azure. They got storage services, they got Azure SQL Database, Service Bus, virtual networks, add-on services, a whole bunch of other really cool things that these various things have access to. So web roles, as I said, pre-configured Windows boxes with IIS pre-installed, default endpoints and firewall rules for port 80, so you don't have to mess with that stuff. And pretty much if you can run it on IIS, you can run it inside a worker role inside, or sorry, a web role inside Azure. The runtime, the Azure runtime, talks to your worker role, or sorry, web role through a special class called webrole.cs. And that gives you a place to write some code whenever your role spins up or starts down or just when it's running. And so what WCF services and web roles is really actually pretty darn easy. In fact, it's almost exactly like doing it in a website was. So let me come back over here to Studio.
You could publish even, again, you do another publish, just point it at
Yep. So I'm going to come back over here and add another project in to my solution. Sorry, get back up to the solution here. And you'll notice that when you install the Azure SDK under Cloud over here, you get the ability to add a cloud service. This is that boundary around, right, my however many web or worker roles I'm going to have. Right, so I'm going to call this my latlon.host.cloud service.
So you have to install the Azure SDK to get this part to show up?
Yep, and I've got the Azure SDK 2.2 installed right now on this guy. And so it says, okay, this cloud service, the boundary of it can host any number of roles. I'm going to add in an ASP.NET web role. And this is really just an ASP.NET website project. I'm going to call it my latlon.host.webrole-host. Come on, host, and say OK. And just like I did with my website, I'm not worrying about all these other things right now. I just want to focus on my WCF service. So I'm going to leave it at empty and go ahead and say OK. And you'll notice that I got a couple of extra projects added in here. I have this cloud service project, which is really just the structural and configuration information about my cloud service. And it knows that I have a single host, single role called this web role host, and there's the code for that guy. And if I open that up, notice it looks just like a regular empty website with a few exceptions. There's references into the Windows Azure assembly, so I can talk to the runtime and configuration and diagnostics and all that good stuff. And then I have this web role class, which inherits from the role entry point, and this is where the runtime can say, hey, role, you're starting up. Is there any code you want to do at startup time? And there's a few other methods I can override on there. There's an override. There's a run method, and that's really what worker roles do. Worker roles run. With web roles, we don't need it, because IIS is going to host my stuff for me, so I don't need to run.
There's typically like a loop and a run method, right?
Yeah, and we'll see that coming up here. And then the other one is on stop. Is there anything you want to run when your role's shutting down? So this would be cleanup or initialization code or anything like that. I'm actually not going to mess with it. I'm going to leave it as is. And I'm going to do the exact same thing that we saw with my website. I'm going to come in here and add in a new web service. WCF service down here. That'll work. And latlon utilities.svc, just like I did in the website. Nothing's going to be different here. Again, it creates the projects, or the code files that I don't need because I already have them up in my contracts and, add reference, not service reference, up in my contracts and services. All right. And then just like I did, in fact, I can even copy out of my web host. There it is. Oh, it was already up on the screen, dork. Down to web role host, modify that. It's exactly the same as the website. It's just the environment that it runs in is going to be slightly different here, right? So I can save that up. And now, if I go up to this cloud service project, I can right-click on this and say Publish. Now, I didn't go create a cloud service ahead of time, right? Let's let this make one for me on the fly, okay? So cloud services, if I jump back up to the portal, those guys are over here on the left-hand side, and you'll see that I've got one in the oven already, but I want a new one to come in here. And so rather than make it here, I could come in to make a cloud service on the, here, but I'll let Visual Studio make it for me
You used to have to do it that way. I mean, this is kind of the evolution. It's going quick.
Yep, Visual Studio can do it for me. So it knows my subscriptions. I'm going to pick that subscription and go on to next, and it says, great, which cloud service do you want to deploy to? I don't want that. I want to make a new one. And so let's call it my Lat Lawn Demo Cloud Service. And we'll go stick it in the West US. And it's right now actually calling into Azure and creating that cloud service for me. And so with that done, if I came back over here, back to cloud services and refreshed, oh, come on. I shouldn't have had to refresh like that. There, 5. There's my Lat Lawn demo. So it just made it for me. It's just empty right now. There's nothing in it. So that's what we're going to deploy. We're going to deploy into the production slot. So web or cloud services, you can actually have 2 copies of your service. One called production, and that's the one that's hit with the formal domain name. Another one called staging. It's exactly the same thing. It just has a GUID-based domain, a host name. That's all.
Usually used for testing purposes.
Yep. So or for pre-deployment, right? So I'll have one running in production. I have another one that I want to be production. So I'll deploy it to staging, I'll test it in staging, you go, looks good, and then we can do what's called a VIP swap, where we basically just swap their IP addresses, and what was staging is now production, and what was production is now staging. So it's really quick, right? Then you can also go, oh, that wasn't right. Flip them back, right? So it's great to do
That's
that.
what I usually do.
So the other way you can do is just redeploy right over one. The only thing to be concerned of with production and staging is that both of them are full copies of your service. So you're going to be billed for 2 copies of whatever you're there. So you do it when you're done, delete the staging one when you're done, right? The leftover one when you're done. So I'm going to deploy directly into production. I'm going to use the Visual Studio release build as opposed to the debug build. And then I've got multiple configurations, and I'll come back and talk about those a little bit later on, but use the configuration that's set up for the cloud. And I'll just next on through this and hit publish. This is going to take a little bit longer than my website, because here it's actually got to go provision a virtual machine. It's got to go get a VM image, find a slot on a rack somewhere to run it, spin the VM up, deploy my code into it. So this guy's going to take a little bit longer to get that done, right? And so I can watch the process of that down here in this Windows Azure activity log. But we're a little time compressed, so rather than make us all wait for that, you saw that I did already have one running up here. So that's this guy. And if I hit the Lat Lawn Utilities.svc service on that, we see it's there, right? And that's really running. So any of you out there, you could use that URL. And I'll go back and update my client.
What if I wanted like 4 copies running of that service that you just deployed? Is there a way to do that easily?
Yeah, you bet. I'll show you that really quick. Let me just update this while I'm here. But back over in the portal, if I drill into the management of that cloud service under the scale, right, I can come in and find that role that I have and just spin up. So here's my Lat Lawn host, web role host. I can say right now I've got 1 copy of it running. I can simply say, give me 2 copies.
I don't have to republish or anything?
No, when I hit save, it's just going to spin another VM up, redeploy my code over to that other VM, and boom, I've got 2 copies of it now.
What about the load balancer? Don't have to tell?
The load balancer is going to wire itself up. It already knows the endpoints, right? So it knows what endpoints you expect from your configuration. So it's going to be able to wire all that up for me. So really cool stuff. Now I'm not going to save that, but if I go back and run my 8 client here.
And now you just point the 8 client to your cloud service,
oops.
not to the web service.
Sorry, I'm running it locally here. I did not mean to do that. I was on the wrong project when I did that. So
that's the emulation environment. That's pretty
this
cool.
Is the Windows Azure Cloud Service Emulator. So we have a Cloud Service Emulator as well as a storage emulator. So, and I imagine, are you hitting the storage emulator later in the demo?
I'm going to go right to real storage, but what I think is awesome about this is I can write the tables, blobs, and queues all on my local machine. I could be in an airplane, no internet connection, and I can just taste everything in the emulation environment. No, there are differences, but for the most part, you can do all your development locally, and then if it works the way you expect, then you can go to a real production storage or compute environment.
Yep, definitely. Now, in fact, again, I mentioned I didn't mean to run that locally here, but since I already did, you'll notice that it's coming up and pointing at just a local loopback address. And if I were to put in latlan utilities, I actually have that service running in the emulator as if it were a web role. And in fact, I can even see that if I come in here, there's this compute emulator UI, and you can sort of view the trace log of the single instance. If you had multiple instances, they'd all be showing up under here, and then you could click on any one of them to see their trace logs showing up over here. So I've got this guy running, and then if I close my browser, it'll shut it down. So I could have copied that URL, repointed my 8.1 client. I think you guys all believe it works locally. Let's just point it at the cloud. So this guy should be shutting down here now.
The tooling is incredible. It lets you just do everything locally. You don't even need the cloud to develop.
Yep. So in fact, we'll come back to this. And, oh, when you added the cloud service, it changed my solution properties. Again, I want to point this back to run whatever the current selection is. So I'm going to click into there, so that's selected. Now when I hit debug, I should get my 8.1 client.
I wanted to mention here to developers, if you want to start learning Azure, you don't even need to have an account per se at the portal. You can just run everything locally on your local machine, get familiar.
At least for web roles, worker roles, and storage.
Right.
Yes. Yeah. For those abstractions, most definitely here. Right. So, did it not run for me? I'll try it one more time, and then we'll just accept that it would have worked, and I'll move on. Oh no, I'm actually having an error. Oh, okay. Let me do a clean, because that'll come back to get me anyhow. So clean it and rebuild. There we go. Try that one more time. There we go. Little bugaboo in VS every now and then. I'll just hit get distances, and all I'm checking is latlan.cloudapp.net. Boom. So it really did go up to a web role running inside a cloud service and pulled my distances back. All right. So pretty cool stuff. The last one then would be worker role. And I may jump through the demo on this pretty quickly here, but if I look at worker roles, remember these are pre-configured virtual machines that just don't have IIS. So you could really do pretty much anything inside these that you wanted to. You can install other products through startup scripts. You have to ship along the media, or the startup script has to be able to go out to the net to get it. But you can do that. But otherwise, you've got this worker role role entry point class that's got that run method. And in there, you can kind of do whatever the heck it is you want to do, right? You could spawn other processes. You can kick off threads. You can sit there and loop and just repeat some process, a number of different patterns that you can use for this.
And these run on Windows Server operating systems.
These are Windows servers, anywhere from Server 2012 R2 all the way down to Server 2008, and you can pick that through what's called the OS family. But anyhow, so hosting a web service in a worker role is a little bit harder because IIS isn't there, and I don't have the ASP.NET, WCF service file type, that SVC that just already knows how to do it. So you have to get back and start writing some code again to make this all happen. So I'll paste in all my code rather than make you watch me type it here, just so we can get through the demo and wrap this module up here. But let me come back up to Cloud Service, and I already had one role. I'm going to add another role in. So I'm going to add a new worker role into this project, and it's just going to be a plain old worker role. This is going to be my latlan.host.worker role host. Now, worker roles don't have endpoints by default. Web roles had port 80, and they know how to do HTTP and all that kind of stuff. To get a worker role to do it, that would actually be a little bit harder because they're dynamic. I'd have to figure out what port they were listening on and then dynamically enable HTTP on it. There's a number of blog posts out there on how to do that. So if that's something of interest to you, I'll leave you to research that on your own. I'm instead going to do a net TCP binding and do it for that. But in order for that to happen, I need to set up a couple of things. First of all, I need this thing to know what its domain name is. So I'm going to come in and configure in here. I've got two different configurations. What's the configuration when it's running in the cloud versus what's the configuration when it's running locally? And you'll notice that these are just XML files. And you could edit these directly, but these role nodes up here give you a nice visual editor. I can click on this, and then it helps me edit not only the configuration files down below, but also what's called the definition file. and the definition file is where I would specify endpoints and some other things like that. So rather than going to edit those XMLs directly, I'm going to come in and do it through this graphical editor. And notice that I can choose, do I want to edit the cloud configuration? That's that file. Or do I want to edit the local configuration? That's that file. Cool. There are some things like endpoints that aren't tied to one of those, and they instead go in the service definition. Cool. So I'm going to start out editing all configurations, and this is where you can do settings. So things like connection strings or other things like that, this is where you would put those. And I want to have the domain, and I'm going to have that default to localhost. But when we actually run up in the cloud, I'm going to have it point at that latlon.cloudapp.net domain name, right? Because I'm going to have to be able to wire up my address endpoints.
Got it.
To be able to listen properly there. So that will be different there. And then the other thing I need to do is go open up a TCP endpoint. So this is where you can open up, this you have to be on all configurations. I'm going to add an endpoint in. I'm going to call it my, actually let me go back to my snippets here really quick.
So the bigger concept going on here, Brett, we have this worker role running in the background, and it's communicating with the web service which we've already deployed. Is that the way to think about this?
Yep. Well, no, I'm sorry. This is going to be the host.
Oh, okay. So
this will be the host. I could shut the web role down.
Good. Okay.
This is going to be the host. Yep. So anyhow, let me get back up to the top here really quick, just so I can get my demo code there. I'm going to implement this guy, and I need to add in WCF TCP port, and I'm going to have it listen on port 81. WCF. There we go. And again, you can steal my snippets here. I just have to make sure that I get the names the same so that my code that I paste in is going to match up correctly. You can call them anything you want. I just have pre-written code, so I have to make sure that I get it all correct in there. Cool. And so now when I come down here and look in these XMLs, notice that in cloud I now have this setting domain that was pointing at latlon.cloudapp.net. In local, I have one that says the setting domain is localhost. And in my service definition, I've got this endpoint called WCF or TCP port that's listening on port 8081 up there. Cool. All right, so those are all there. And so now I can steal my code. And I walk you through doing it slowly. I'm instead going to just go copy the whole kit and caboodle here. And back over to my worker role, you'll notice that I have this single class in here called worker role. It's a role entry point. Remember, I talked about that run method. There it is. And it's got a default loop that just sits there and loops every 10 seconds and just spits out some trace data and says, I'm working. Well, I'm going to replace all of that with this code that I just pasted in. And I got to go add in a few service references. So add a service reference off to my contracts and services. And then also from assemblies under, extensions, no, framework, there we go. I need that system.service model. And then wire up some endpoints, or sorry, some imports, there we go. Just importing the namespaces for all of these things here, just by hitting Control Dot on the red squiggle line and then picking the top item there to import the using statement for that namespace. All right, and I think I got them all there. Oh, I got two runs there. Sorry, I didn't get the top of run. Let me try that one more time. I know I'm zoomed way out. Don't worry, I'll zoom back in here. I just needed to see my code a little bit better. Binding, I got to import that. All right, so I think I'm good here. All right, so all I did here is this run method here is going to first spit out some trace information. And then just like I did in my console host, I'm going to go spin up a host. It's going to listen, or it's going to expose one of those Latlon utility services. This is just like I did in my console host earlier. But I need to go get that domain name out of the configuration by going and reading from the Azure configuration the value for that domain setting. Remember, it was localhost locally, and then latlon.cloudapp.net running up in the cloud. It then knows that the fixed port is port 81, but if I spin up multiple web roles, they're going to have dynamic ports. So I need to also go figure out what the dynamic port is for those guys. And if you grab my source code, I've got descriptive comments that'll walk you through this. But I go in and ask it, say, hey, what's my endpoint for this TCP port? And go get me my address and my port, so I know my exact address and TCP port. And then I wire up these URIs for it to actually listen on. So then I can create the NetTCP bindings, and when I create my endpoints, I can say, hey, listen on NetTCP, here's the IP address, here's the port, and listen on either metadata or on the service behaviors, right? Open up the host, and then leave it open. I then just enter in a loop that just sits there and loops forever and ever and ever and hosts my service for me. So pretty cool stuff. And I've already got that implemented. I've got it running up in the cloud, so I'm not going to make you watch me redeploy it, although I could. I won't. And remember, it was listening on port 8081, but it's the net.tcp binding instead. So let me go copy that. You can even test it with the WCF test client. Sorry. Connect to the service, add that in, paste in that URI. Hopefully, and it's not happy with me. Okay, well, if this fails, that's all right. That's my fault for failing on that. But let me test it really quick on the client. Latlon service. Oh, it's not service. Sorry, I got that. That was my point problem there. Let me copy it back here. This is actually going to be listening on, and it will tell me if I were running locally here. At TCP. That's the one I want, is that guy. Let me test that again really quick. And this was latlon.cloudapp.net and listening on port 8081. There we go. There's those guys, right? So if I go in and configure that, then all right. Now this 8.1 client can actually go point to my worker role hosted service that's running up there. Now I didn't redeploy. I would have done that, but again, I'm running way over on time here, so my apologies for the pace. But we'll just do one last test here, get distances, and notice that it is in fact using the NetTCP binding, and it's pulling back my services. So, whirlwind there.
So that service has lived in 3 places so far. It's lived in a website, it's lived in a web role, and it's lived in a worker role.
Yeah, in fact, it started out as a console app running locally.
So 4.
Then we had it running as a website on the local machine. Then we published it as a website into Azure. Then we had it running as a local web role running in the Azure emulator. And then we deployed it up into the Azure Cloud Service, and then running in a worker role inside a cloud service. So, and notice that all of that was really, all I was changing there is where I hosted it. At no point did I ever go change the source code for the service or the contract. I was just changing what the host was. Cool. Well, my apologies for running over, but hopefully you got a good survey there of some of the different execution environments for running code up in Azure. And so let's go ahead and we'll take a break and start back up in 10. All right, thanks.
Nice work, Brad.
All right.